Hey, Deb here. Welcome to my purchase agreement video. It's the most riveting 27 minutes of your life. Okay, it's not the most fascinating, but it's really important. It's important to me that you understand what you're agreeing to, because once a contract is signed, it is a legally binding document. So it's important to just not take it lightly and understand all the ins and outs, especially pay attention to the inspection section, okay? But stop it, pause it, make notes of questions, and let's talk about any questions that you have. Section A is the buyer, so that's you, and we want the names to match if you're applying for a mortgage, however you applied for the mortgage there, just because the lender's going to make us do a bunch of extra paperwork if we don't make those names match. Section B is about the property, so it's got the property address and the legal description, and then there's a paragraph there that talks about all the extra stuff in addition to the land. Anything that's permanently affixed to the property should stay with the property. So this is what it says. They're not going to take the furnace or the water heater or the AC unit, but it's also where we're going to specify on line 17 whether you're going to ask for appliances, what's staying, and then on line 19 if there's anything excluded, like, hey, I don't want that place set in the backyard, take that with you, kind of thing. And then if you're buying a home that's on propane, the line 21 talks about how the remaining fuel in the propane tank is going to be handled. Section C is about price. So here's where you would put in how much you're offering to pay for the home. The other important thing in this paragraph is that it creates the appraisal contingency. So on lines 29 and 30, it says if the buyer obtains an appraisal of the property, that the agreement's contingent on the property appraising at no less than that purchase price. So that just means that you don't have to buy it if it does not appraise for the purchase price. But most of the time we just try to renegotiate, or the buyer brings a little bit of extra money to the table. Because we're usually pretty close. We don't have a big problem in this area of homes not appraising. Section D talks about the earnest money. That's what you put down sort of as a down payment, but it shows the seller that you have some skin in the game, that you're not going to just walk away for no reason whatsoever, that if you violate the terms of the contract, that they get to keep your earnest money. So section 1 of that, D1, is where it specifies how much earnest money, and we can talk about what an acceptable amount is, but it's usually somewhere between $1,000 to $3,000, somewhere in that range, unless it's a higher priced home. And then that money has to be delivered within however many days, in this example, 2 days after the acceptance of the offer. The earnest money is typically held by the listing broker in their escrow account, and section 2 is what talks about what the listing broker can and can't do with that money. So we have a lot of rules and guidelines around that. They're not playing the ponies, they're not making interest on it. It's sitting in their escrow account and they disperse it for certain reasons. They will bring it to closing and it'll be a credit towards your purchase, or if the contract falls through, this kind of outlines how that is handled. Section D number 3 is just sort of the we really mean it portion of the contract. There's a few of these tucked in throughout here that just says that if the buyer fails or refuses to close the transaction without legal cause, meaning you've basically violated the terms of the contract, then the earnest money can be retained by the seller for damages, and that everyone has legal duty to use good faith and due diligence, et cetera, et cetera. So just do what the contract says and you'll be fine. It's very rare that anyone loses their earnest money unless they just blatantly violate the terms of the contract. But that's why listening to this and asking questions is so important, because you are entering into a legally binding contract. So you want to make sure what you are agreeing to. Section E does 2 things. It's talking about how you're going to pay for the property. So first, you're going to disclose how you're going to pay for the property. Sellers have a right to know that information. They evaluate offers based on that. And then the second is, if you're getting a mortgage, then it creates your financing contingency. So it says that completion of the transaction is contingent on your ability to obtain a certain kind of mortgage. Now, the numbers that we put in here don't tie you to those numbers. So for example, I've put 95%, so they're doing a 5% down payment. But if they come up with an extra 10 and they can put 15% down, then that's great. They're not tied to that. It's just creating what I call a worst case scenario. So the best example I can give is in this, on the screen in front of you, it says an interest rate not to exceed 4%. Certainly we hope you can get less than that. But if interest rates were to some reason overnight skyrocket to 17%, this is your out that says you don't have to buy the property and you can terminate the agreement and get your earnest money back. On line 71, there's a note that says see further conditions. That is if we're going to ask the seller to help pay for closing costs, and we'll get to that at the end when we've got a further conditions section. The other items, the conditional sales contract, assumption of mortgages, those are things that are not used very often. Section F talks about going to get the mortgage. So it's basically saying to the seller that you're not going to wait until the day before closing and then say, oh, I need to get a mortgage today. That you understand it's a process and that you're going to do your part to move through that process as expeditiously as possible so that you'll apply for the mortgage within, for example, 3 days after the acceptance of the agreement. And we'll help you with that, sending contracts to the lender and that sort of thing. And that within 30 days of the offer being accepted, you would have mortgage approval. So again, just wanting to make sure, reassure the seller that you're going to move through the process as quickly as possible. Section G is a big one. There's a lot of information in here, but it's basically talking about the actual closing. So this is where we're going to put in the date that we're offering to close. That's number one. Number two is a fee that the title company charges. These are not the same as your closing costs. There are other closing costs associated with getting a mortgage. That's not what this is about. This is simply about the fee that the title company charges to manage the paperwork and do the closing, and that is typically a fee that's shared by both the buyer and the seller. Number three is if the purchase was contingent on the sale of another property. We would talk about that in this section. Section 4 is just talking about an Indiana state law that says that if you have to bring more than $10,000 to closing, so that's your down payment and your closing costs, that money has to be wired. That's a state law, so it's talking about that. And then number 5 is just a reminder about wire fraud. We have seen a little bit of that going on here in Indiana. So it's just stating that we highly recommend that if you are wiring funds because of number 4, the Good Funds Law, that you confirm those wiring instructions with the title company, like by calling them just to make sure that you're using the right number. Because once you wire funds away, then you cannot get them back. The possession section of the purchase agreement talks about the date that you get possession. Sometimes it's at closing. Sometimes we negotiate that the seller's allowed to have possession for a few days after closing. And then line 21 talks about if the seller did not get out by when they were supposed to and hand over possession, there is a financial penalty. So that is supposed to incent them to do what they're supposed to do. Number 2 of that is that they are required to maintain the property in the same condition, and that they should remove trash and personal property before turning over possession. Now, it doesn't say anything about cleaning, and some sellers are great about giving the home a deep clean before turning it over. Some maybe not so much. So just want to be clear that that's not necessarily an expectation, but it certainly is a hope. Number 3 of that section talks about casualty loss, which means that if something like, say, a tree falls through the roof prior to closing, you have the option to terminate the agreement, or you can close the transaction, but work with the seller and their insurance company to make sure that things get repaired. And then number 4 is that they are responsible for utility costs through the date of possession as well. Section I talks about survey. Now, typically in neighborhoods or even in smaller properties, we don't do surveys. We typically have that box checked as waived unless there is a concern about encroachment. So if it looks like the neighbor has a barn that is potentially on this property, then it might be something where we ask for some survey work to be done. But typically surveys are just reserved for large parcels of land, like 60 acres or more kind of thing. Section A is just a contingency that says if the property is in a floodplain, you may or may not terminate the agreement. So you would choose one. Typically, we choose that you may terminate the agreement. Most of the time at this point, if you're getting ready to make an offer, we are aware if the property is in a floodplain or not. That is something that the sellers are required to disclose. But if something comes up down the road and it requires flood insurance that no one was aware of, that can be pretty pricey and can kind of change your monthly budget quite a bit. So it gives you that out if that is the case. Section K is a section we don't use very much. This is more for if you are purchasing the property for commercial purposes and you needed some time to ensure that the zoning was appropriate for that, that you could terminate the agreement. So typically, this section doesn't come into play. Section L is a contingency about being able to get homeowners insurance on the property. There really aren't a lot of reasons why you couldn't get homeowners insurance, but if for some reason, there was a history of the home that precluded you from being able to get homeowners insurance, this is what would allow you to terminate the agreement if you so choose. Section M is simply an advisory that's telling you that I know nothing about nothing, and that if you have any concerns about environmental contaminants or anything like that, like lead-based paint, radon, mold, meth, that you should seek out inspection and advice from qualified professionals, and we can help point you in the right direction there, but that you'll have the opportunity to do your due diligence if those are concerns for you. Section M talks about inspections, and this is a really important section. It's where most people sort of get tripped up if they were going to violate the terms of the contract. The first numbers 1, 2, and 3 are just talking about whether you're going to do inspections or not. So typically we check number 2, which says you reserve the right to have independent inspections and that it's at the buyer's expense and that it'll be conducted by qualified contractors or licensed inspectors. Every once in a while, we may have a situation where we waive inspections where the property is sold as is. When a property is sold as is, you can still do inspections. You just can't ask for any repairs. So if that's your situation, we can talk a little bit more about that in depth. The next part of the inspection section is really the most important, so maybe play this part twice. Letter A just talks about how long you have to do inspections. So typically it's 14, 15, 16 days, something like that, and that starts the day the offer is accepted. It's my job to keep track of timelines, so I'll make sure that you know what you need to be doing when you need to be doing them. Section B is just saying that these are all the things that you would potentially have inspected. Section C doesn't come into play very often, but if something in the initial inspection reveals the presence of lead-based paint, radon, mold, or any condition that requires further testing, so you need a contractor to come back out and look at something a little bit more in depth, then this gives us an additional 5 days to do that. Section D talks about inspection responses. So it's basically saying that if you don't respond within the inspection timeline and let the seller know whether you're asking for repairs or not, then you're accepting the home in its current condition. And likewise, if the seller doesn't respond to our inspection requests, then they are agreeing to them. So it's really important that we understand and stick with those timelines there. Section E, this is the most important. If a defect is identified, then the buyer has to give the seller a copy of the inspection report or the portions of the inspection report that relate to that defect. And then they have to give the seller an opportunity to remedy it. They have to give the seller a chance to make it right. Now, you as the buyer can kind of determine what that looks like and how you would want it repaired, but you have to give the seller. You can't just do the inspection and walk away. You have to try and, in good faith, try and negotiate something with the seller. And then after negotiations, if you can't get the deal together and get everyone to agree on how to move forward, then that's when we can start to talk about terminating the transaction. Now, Section G is what is a defect, because that's a pretty broad term. So this is under Indiana law, basically saying that a defect is something that has an adverse effect on the value of the property, is a health or safety hazard, or if not repaired, would shorten the lifespan of the home. So I always explain it like if there's a hole in a roof and it's causing water to get in and that's deteriorating the wood, then the trusses, that's a problem. That's shortening the lifespan of the home. If there's a carbon monoxide leak, that's a health and safety issue. But if there's a hole in a window screen, that doesn't necessarily meet that definition of defect. Section H is saying that anything that's previously been disclosed isn't necessarily grounds for termination of the agreement. And then Section I is just another one of those contract terms that says, I know nothing about nothing, but you should rely on home inspectors and experts who do know things about the condition of the home. Okay, let's talk about what a home warranty is. This is not anything that you're required to have. It makes sense for some people, it doesn't make sense for other people. So if you have questions specific to your situation about it, let's chat a little bit. A home warranty is kind of like an insurance program for the insides of the home. So it would cover you for a year, and it's something you could ask the seller to provide. It costs around $500. If the furnace goes out for the first year, you just pay a deductible of usually $100 and it gets repaired. What's important to understand is that this does impact the seller's bottom line. So it's not free money. It's not something extra that the seller won't take into account. It comes off your bottom line. So, whatever your offer is, you would kind of subtract $500 off it because that's what the seller would be netting. That's how they're going to evaluate whether a home warranty is something that they're willing to offer or not. So let me know if you have questions about the home warranty. Hopefully, if we're at this point in the process, you've received a copy of the seller's disclosures. That's a document that's required in the state of Indiana for sellers to complete that just discloses if there are any known defects with the home. It's a pretty simple document. It's not something I would put a ton of weight behind, but that is something that we're required to provide you in most occasions. Some instances, if it's an estate-owned property, a bank-owned property, there are not seller's disclosures. And then if the home was built prior to 1978, there should also be a lead-based paint certification indicating whether they've ever had any testing done for lead-based paint. Section Q talks about title work and title approval and title insurance. And honestly, it's something that you probably won't remember after I explain it to you, and that's okay. It's not something that is typically needed, but it's important to have because if you don't have it, you could lose everything, all of your investment, your home, and everything. So it's very rare that it comes into play, but when it does, if it did, you would be happy to have it. There are 2 title insurance policies that are involved. One is insuring you as the owner and the purchase price of the house. So what this means is that if someone comes knocking on your door and says, hey, this was my grandparents' farm and I own this house and something got messed up at the courthouse with the deed and so you can't own the house, then you go to the title company, you have that title insurance, and they're going to pay off or do whatever's needed to clear everything up so that you keep your home. There's a second title insurance policy that is the lender's title insurance policy. If you have a mortgage, your lender has a financial stake in the property as well. So they want to make sure that if something comes up that they are insured too. So typically the sellers pay the owner's title insurance policy and the buyer pays the lender's title insurance policy. On line 268, we're just saying that we're going to go ahead and order title insurance as soon as possible so that if we did come up against any hiccups, again, which rarely happens and most of them are pretty easy to rectify if something does come up. It's usually a clerical error at the courthouse, but that we'll have that ordered and be working through that process pretty quickly. And then it also designates who gets to choose the title insurance company. Sometimes it's the seller, sometimes it's the buyer. If you have a preference, let me know. Most buyers don't. Title companies aren't something that people use on a regular basis, but if you do have a preference, let me know. Okay, section R, let's see if we can wade our way through property taxes. It's a little bit confusing, kind of like title insurance. You can impress your friends at parties and explain to them how it works if you want, but it's okay if you forget how it works. We're always happy to explain it to you. So there are a few options, but what's important to understand is that property taxes in the state of Indiana are paid in arrears. So that means that the year passes and then the following year, the property tax bill comes due for that previous year. So let me put up an example that kind of explains how we handle property taxes. So you may know that we have property taxes that are typically due in May and November of every year. So the May tax bill in this example, May 2021, is going to cover the time period of January through June of 2020 of the previous year. So if we assume a closing date of March 15th of 2021, then you didn't own the home during that time period, that January through June of 2020. It was the previous year. So what happens at closing is that the seller gives you a credit for the property tax bill and then the buyer pays it when it comes due. So that credit actually is going to offset some of your closing costs. And if you're escrowing for your property taxes, meaning your lender's going to pay them, there isn't anything you really need to remember to do. It's just going to be some math, moving numbers from one column to the other at closing. So you'll see that on your closing statements and property tax prorations. So just want to finish out this table. So a property tax bill that's due in November of 2021 would cover the time period of July through December of 2020. the previous year, didn't own the home during that time period if you're purchasing it in March of 2021. So again, the seller gives you another credit for the property tax bill and you pay it when it comes due, or your lender pays it when it comes due. Now, in May 2022, there's going to be a property tax bill that covers January through June of 2021, so the first half of 2021. And you will have owned the home for part of that time period, March 15th through June 30th. So the seller's going to give you a partial credit for that time period that they owned that home, which is January 1st through March 14th. So you'll see that on your closing statement. If you want us to explain that to you, again, we are more than happy to. It's just sort of a weird Indiana thing. So typically in this section, going back to the purchase agreement, we check box number 2, which says that property taxes are handled via prorations, just like I explained to you. There are other ways to handle property taxes, but 9,999 times out of 10,000, this is the way that they're handled. Section S is one of those contract sections that is sort of rarely comes into play, but I'm going to explain it to you because it's on there. It's typically more used for someone purchasing a condo. Sometimes with condos, there are special assessments on top of the monthly HOA dues to cover, a major capital improvement project. And so this is talking about how those special assessments will be handled, being prorated between the buyer and the seller. But that's typically how it's used. Section T is another one of those standard contract clauses that talks about time, that we have time periods and deadlines throughout the contract, and we all agree to stick to them. But what's really important in this section is lines 314 and 315. So I want you to take a look at those. And that states that the seller and the buyer have the right to withdraw any offer or counteroffer prior to written acceptance and delivery of such offer or counteroffer. What that means is that if you make an offer on a property and you say, hey, seller, we'll give you a couple days to think about it, that's fine, you can do that. But anytime prior to the seller accepting your offer, you could withdraw or rescind that offer. So you wake up the next morning and you say, what did I do? I don't want to buy this house. As long as the seller hasn't accepted your offer yet, you can rescind your offer. Everybody goes back to where they were. It works the other way too, though, and this is where buyers get tripped up. So the seller maybe counters back. And they're like, hey, you can take a couple days to think about it. And so you take a couple days to think about it. Meanwhile, another buyer comes, looks at the house, decides they like it, makes an offer. It's better than yours. The seller can rescind that counteroffer that you're thinking about and thinking on and sleeping on before you've accepted it. And you're out completely in the cold. So that is to say that you want to make decisions as quickly as you're comfortable making decisions. I'm not going to pressure you, but I'm also going to encourage you to not dilly-dally because we don't want anybody else getting in there and you lose out completely. Section U pertains to if you're purchasing a home that has a homeowner association or a condo association, basically stating that the seller has to provide you copies of the covenants and restrictions, any homeowner association documents within a certain time period. And if there is any approval of the sale required by the association, that has to be done within a certain time period. Section V is another one of those standard contract clauses. It talks about attorney fees. If this contract had to be enforced in the court of law, the losing party would pay the winning party's attorney fees. That's pretty standard. Section W is a bit of a catch-all section that just gives you some disclosures and some helpful information. So the highlights of this, I think numbers 3 and 4 are important if you're concerned about meth labs or sex offender registries. Here are sites to go look at, but that the buyer is responsible for feeling at peace with whatever they need to do for that. Number 5 talks about the kind of deed you're going to get, which is a warranty deed, the best kind of deed. Number 7 is basically saying that emailed signatures, digital signatures are just as good as live signatures. We all agree to that. And then going over to the next page, number 12 is another important one, which is saying that I may refer people to you, whether that's a painter or a home inspector or a lender, and that you are free to choose whoever you want, outside of my recommendations, as you're just based on my experience. Section X, which is further conditions, a lot of times this is blank, but it's where we put anything extra that we might want to address, whether that is asking for Michael Jordan posters. I had that once. Or a lot of times what we use that for closing costs. So if you are asking for the seller to help pay your closing costs, this is the example that I have in here right now, where we talk about what those closing costs can cover and how much exactly you're asking for. Other things that might go in there, if there's a note about possession or there's a note about when something specific is going to happen, we might put that in further conditions. So it's just sort of an extra spot to cover something that maybe isn't in the basic contract. Section Y, consult your advisors, is just another advisement that if you have concerns about the property or you have concerns about the contract, you have the right to consult attorneys, tax accountants, engineers, anybody who may make you feel more at peace with moving forward. But obviously that has to be done within the time constraints that we're working with, but we'll help you make that happen. Section Z, acknowledgements, is where we are disclosing whether or not this is a limited agency transaction. So this means, do you have your own representation or is the same realtor representing both the buyer and the seller? That has to be disclosed to you. And if it is a limited agency transaction, it's important that you understand the limitations with that. And then the next section talks about the expiration time and date. So if the seller doesn't respond by that time and date, the purchase agreement is null and void. Typically, we like to give 24 hours when it's possible, but sometimes if there's a lot of interest, we may shorten that up a little bit. So I'll give you advice on what the best tactic is with that. The next paragraph is another one of those standard contract clauses that talks about this contract can be executed simultaneously or in two or more counterpoint parts, which means that if there are two people purchasing a home, you could each sign your own copy of the contract, and we put those together and we all agree that that is like having signatures on the same single contract. And that also we transmit, everyone agrees that we can transmit documents electronically or digitally. And the very last page is where the buyers sign, and then the seller has the opportunity to respond. They can either accept, reject, or they can counter. If they counter the offer, they'll mark that little box said counter and sign it, and then they'll present us a separate document that is the counter offer. Are you still here? I feel like I should do the end of that Ferris Bueller movie. I don't know, do you know that? Everybody's sitting in the theater watching the credits and he keeps going, are you still here? Go home, go home. Are you still here? If you have any questions at all about any of the sections that I just went over, please shoot me an email, a text, give me a call, and I'll make sure that you understand. Good luck with